Hi, this is Lana from Psychosomatic Alchemy, and today we're talking about ego. Everything about ego, or rather the most important things that we as practitioners need to know in order to have, on one hand, a healthy day-to-day life and healthy interpersonal relationships, and on another hand, so that we can ultimately transcend the ego and reach our perfect human potential, which we all have. So first we have to identify what is ego. Ego is, has one kind of definition in psychology, and it also has a very different kind of connotation in spirituality and, in the language of like mainstream sort of conversations. So psychologically speaking, we cannot exist without the ego. Ego is our sense of self. It's the concept that I'm here and you're there, and concept that, I have to feed myself and I have to sleep and I have to do whatever to survive. Okay, so then ego has its mechanism that's basically there to keep us safe, to ensure our survival. And in prehistoric times, it was very useful. Ego tends to be very kind of tense way to relate to our surrounding, because we are interpreting everything in the context of survival. So whether it's a wild animal coming to get us, or just feeling the sense of like, okay, I feel hunger, I'm gonna die if I don't eat. All of these mechanisms kind of work together to ensure that we are well and that we get everything we need. Now, the software, the prehistoric software that was very relevant and useful back in the day when our everyday life was ridden with all kinds of dangers, it actually survives to today. So that in today's life, when things are different, in modern life, right, the dangers are not so kind of lurking everywhere, the mechanism is pretty intense. Which means that even in like lightly stressful situation, we may kind of experience and relate to such events in a way that's like disproportionate to the actual intensity of the situation. And this is, this is one of the ways where we have a problem, because ego is, or, ego mechanism is primed to be so self-protective to the extent that even when somebody just like criticizes us or even just gives us a constructive criticism, will freak out. This mechanism is very automatic, so it's very difficult to control. And we've all had experience of being in some kind of situation where we exaggerated and then we kind of maybe feel ashamed or regretful, about our reaction. Well, this is the aim of the ego mechanism. It's, it's literally primed. We're biologically primed to be overprotective. And the work of psychology and spirituality is to help disarm these kind of over-the-top mechanisms that keep us constantly stressed out, constantly on the lookout, super defensive, and ultimately unhappy. So let's look at the ego from the perspective of spirituality. So when we discuss ego in a spiritual context, we are talking about something that we want to go away with. So it's aspect of our personality that's actually problematic and that leads us to kind of greater suffering, that causes problems in interpersonal relationships and so forth. We can identify the positive and negative aspects of the ego. So the negative aspects would be, being overly protective, feeling threatened, feeling insecure, arrogant, things of that nature, right? So things that ultimately contribute to a problem, whether it's in reference to ourselves or in reference to the world around us. And then there are the positive aspects of the ego, which are connectedness, love, compassion, altruism, caring, loving kindness, patience, and so forth. So what our work is to minimize the negative manifestations of the ego and to maximize the positive qualities. Why? Well, simply because the negative aspects make our life more miserable, and then the positive aspects are basically helping us grow into happy, fulfilled, self-sufficient individuals who can coexist peacefully in the world with other people and other sentient beings. And this is precisely the aim of spirituality. So let's demonstrate the example between the positive and negative ego. So on one hand, let's look at arrogance. Arrogance is this sense of superiority. It says, I am better than everybody else. So we derive kind of positive feeling about ourselves by comparing to others. There always has to be kind of a reference outside of ourselves that help us determine our value. So we're either better than someone or we're worse than someone, or we're equals, in which case there is like a hidden competition going on. This is how the ego is wired, actually, the kind of the primordial, the primal ego. And then on another hand, what's sort of similar but more wholesome is confidence. So confidence is about feeling good about ourselves, but it's not dependent on others. It's simply being aware and appreciating our innate capacity. We feel good about our skills and our abilities and our sense of self. And confidence is stable because it's something that once we have it, right? Or when we have it, it's something that's self-sustaining. I don't have to compare with somebody else to feel confident. It's just something I feel inside of me. Whereas with arrogance, it's different. Somebody who has a problem with arrogance, on a good day, they feel arrogant and superior and unbearable to others, may I add. And on a bad day, that same person will feel low self-esteem. When we compare with others, where does that even come from? It comes from constantly questioning our value. So when somebody shows up, we're immediately, the self-protective ego is immediately like, oh, am I good enough? Am I worthy enough? Am I valuable? And then there is this like impulse to compare in order to assess oneself, thinking like, oh, am I better than this person or am I worse? So, and then of course, when we feel arrogant, we relate to others in a very toxic kind of way. If we think we're better, there is some kind of pride arising. And then we also tend to, it basically inflates the ego. And we just feel so self-important. So and here we're stuck in duality. On one hand, we're arrogant. On another hand, there is low self-esteem. If you really think about it, if you understand that that ultimately both states come from like a place of insecurity, it's really, they seem like two contradictory things, but they're really one and the same thing, just two different extremes. So from that perspective, it's something that we want to go away with. It's the kind of sense of self that we derive in an unhealthy way. And it's also based on delusions, because this concept of like better or worse is completely arbitrary. For instance, objectively speaking, I may be more skilled at something than somebody else, but then that person might be better at something else. So who's to say that I am better? It's very relative. It's very based on what I value as important. Somebody else might value something else as important. So from that perspective, this concept of better or worse is completely relative and arbitrary, and it's not true. It's just kind of like an illusion. We're all different. We all are unique. We all have challenges and positive states of mind. So now let's jump back into spiritual sort of context. So spirituality is about growing the positive aspects and minimizing the negative. In Tibetan Buddhism, for example, there is a notion that human beings and the mind has, certain qualities like love, connection, joy. These things are presented as being innate to our nature. And then the negative aspects like jealousy, arrogance, distraction, anger, hatred, and so forth, these are actual pollutions. And these things are actually not innate to our nature, which means that we can extract them. A really good metaphor for this is if you have a glass full of muddy water, if you keep stirring the water, the water is going to keep being muddy. So that's like when we're mentally afflicted, when we're angry, it's kind of like stirring the water. So water is going to stay muddy. But once we calm ourselves, we practice meditation, we practice kindness, we follow methodology that helps us get rid of negative qualities. What happens is that in the state of stillness, the mud settles, and then we can sort of see that there is water on top that's kind of clear, and the mud is at the bottom, and the water can be purified, mind can be purified, and we can return to our original state, which is wisdom, love, purity, and so forth. Let's talk about morality for a second. Morality in a conventional sense is important. It's important to have certain kind of moral code by which we, treat people the way we want to be treated so that we can have kind of a world of peace and love and so forth. What we're focusing on is what is the result of doing behavior X and behavior Y? What is the result of going away with anger to us, right, to ourselves? Well, what is the result? The result is we're less afflicted. We suffer less. We feel more at peace. So from that perspective, then we can identify these as negative qualities. Like, it's not about morality, it's about cause and effect. It's about how these things affect us and other people. Same with the positive qualities. If we cultivate love, compassion, and so forth, we're going to be more at peace, we're going to be happier, and we're going to reach our potential. And being in a state of bliss and happiness is a positive thing. So it's important to identify good and bad in the context of like the effect on our well-being, because by doing that, we can talk about problems of ego in a way that's not triggering the ego. Because if we say like, oh, you're acting in this way and you're bad, you know, you're problematic, you're not a good person. Like that starts to impede or kind of reflect on our sense of self, our value. You know, and this is where we, you know, it's also a problem with self-loathing, right? So we say like, oh, I did this, this, and that, and I'm a bad person. And then we like hate ourselves. And so we want to take morality out of it. And we just want to say, I don't want to engage in these behaviors because it just makes me suffer. You know, it makes me miserable. So that's like something good to keep in mind, something helpful. Now let's talk for a minute about 3 poisons in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, philosophy, are identified as attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And I'm going to describe what each of these are and how they relate to the ego. So attachment is basically, what that refers to is ego grasping. So it's like grasping to this sense of self. Attachment means that we're invested in certain kind of object, person, or outcome that we think will make us feel good. And the problem with attachment is that when we don't get what we want, we lose our peace and we become miserable. So here, attachment, it's not just mere desire. It's okay to desire. There's no problem in desiring and going for what we want. The problem is that we have this program that when we can't attain what we think we like, it completely impacts our state of happiness, you know, and we become miserable. The problem here is that we look to the external to find some kind of happiness and satisfaction. So another word for attachment is addiction. When we see people who are like addicted to drugs or alcohol, we can see that there is a problem. Like we can see that when they have some kind of issue, their coping mechanism is to reach for a substance. And, you know, by taking the substance, they feel better, it takes away anxiety or whatever it is. And then they kind of get a temporary fix of forgetting about their problems. But then we know that the issue is like, you know, once you get off the trip or once you get off the alcohol binge, you know, you go back to being miserable. And the problem for which you reached for substance or alcohol is still there. It didn't go away. So we can see very easily that somebody who has addiction problem has a problem. But in reality, we all have addiction problem, and it's called ego grasping. It's attachment. It's in the same category. You know, it's this kind of thing like I must have this or I'm going to be miserable. In spirituality, what we want to do is we want to identify how can we find peace and happiness and fulfillment without depending on things going the way we want. It's actually very possible to do that. That's actually the whole purpose of spirituality, right? Which we'll talk about later. And then we have aversion on another hand. So we have attachment, aversion, ignorance. Aversion is another word for hatred. It's a milder word for hatred. So it's basically, we want to avoid something at all costs. On one hand, it can be a positive thing, obviously, but on another hand, the problem is that when we cannot avoid something negative or something that we dislike, then we suffer. So it's like the same thing, right? And the thing with both aversion and attachment is when we cannot get what we do want and when we cannot avoid what we don't want, we're in trouble. You know, we're having really hard time. I mean, this is people commit suicide for these reasons. So this is really, really fundamental. It's like our entire notion of happiness or suffering is dependent on these two things. But again, these things happen because of our fundamental ignorance about our capacity, and it actually comes to our misperception of reality. And that's the third poison, the poison of ignorance. In Buddhist philosophy, when we use the word ignorance in this context of the 3 poisons, it refers specifically to misperception of reality, misperception of phenomena in our reality, and misperception of ourselves. This is like a really big subject, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly so you can have kind of a context. The misperception is that we see ourselves as separate, kind of independent. We see ourselves in kind of a frozen way. So, for example, you know, when we feel bad and when we're depressed, we are very locked into seeing ourselves as kind of like, there is no light at the end of a tunnel, I'm no good, I don't, you know, I'm not beautiful, or I'm not whatever, or I don't have this skill, or I don't have this thing. So it's like we're very locked in, and it's very difficult when we're in that state of depression and anxiety. It's very difficult like to step outside of that and to have like a positive kind of thought. Same thing with arrogance. You know, when we're arrogant, we're totally locked into this like ego trip, this superiority complex. Think about the time that you were in love with somebody and then you entered the relationship and then the relationship went downhill and then you went your own way. Okay, so think of a person like that and go back in time and think about what was your experience of this person when you first fell in love with them. All you could see is the positive qualities, things that appealed to you, and you couldn't stop thinking about them and you were obsessed with them and they couldn't do anything wrong, and even if they did something wrong, you know, you could tolerate it, you could say it like, oh, it's, you found some kind of excuse, right? So that's, that's being in the state of attachment. That's where the mind, when we're in a state of attachment, our mind, we're separated from reality because our mind overlays kind of like pink colored glasses, and what we see is exaggerated positive qualities. And some of those qualities are real, but the way we see them in an exaggerated way. So we see everything 10 times better than it actually is, right? Now fast forward to when you're in relationship, and then you start to see the actual person. So you're no longer in a kind of love haze. You're starting to see things more as they are. So you start to see problems, and this is where attachment starts to wear off, and what starts to come in is aversion. And now fast forward a little bit to the point where like you are kind of fed up with a person, or you want to break up, or even sometime after the breakup, because I think attachment is still pretty strong when we're breaking up with a person, but like later on, after you're over it, now you look back at the person and you're like, wow, how could I have been with this person? It's like, it's ridiculous. You almost kind of like nauseated. It's like, what's wrong with me? What did I see in them? That's aversion. Aversion, when we're in a state of aversion, we fixate on the negative qualities and we exaggerate the negative qualities. So you have one person, that's one and the same person, that's being perceived in completely different ways by you at different points in time. At one moment you saw them as divine and perfect and they can do no wrong and they're unmatched and etc. The most appealing thing in the universe. So at one point you see them as that. At another point you see them as like, disgusting, horrible. Somebody else will look at them and have their own sort of idea of what they see. So whose view is valid? One object, many different perceptions. So we have to say that each of those views were actually valid, because for you in that moment the experience was real. It affected you in a real way. But which of these views were objectively accurate? And the answer is none of them. In fact, there is no objective view. There is only ever subjective view. So ignorance is seeing an object and believing that what we see is actually truly out there. So while views can be valid, and often are, always are, I mean, whatever your experience, it's valid, right? Because it's your experience. But whether it's accurate from the ultimate sense, now that's a big question. And problem is that we confuse our perception to be the reality. In neurolinguistic programming, there is a presupposition that's supposed to describe this sort of notion, and it says map is not the territory. We all have like a map of reality, and we all have some kind of way to relate to other people and to objects in our environment in a way that works for us. It functions, it keeps us going, it keeps us afloat. I can go to work and I can make my money and I can pay for my food, and it's like all these things are valid. But in the ultimate sense, all that it is just like a projection. But the question is, what is the actual reality outside of those projections? The ignorance is that we believe that what we see is reality itself. We think that reality is out there, and then I sort of come in with my senses, I perceive things, and what I see is what I get, or what I see is what is there. And actually that's not the case. Like, we're constantly in a self-referential state of relating to things from the place of ego. If there are people out there in the world, and people who are sharing my worldview and who are on my side and who are nice to me, I label them as friends, and I love them and I wish them all the well, and I'm attached to them, and I overlay more positive qualities on them than they actually have, and that's like my group. So that's like a very ego referential point of looking at the world. Then we have the world that we have a population that disagrees with us. Think about how we feel about people who are on the opposite spectrum of the political arguments. We absolutely cannot stand them. We feel aversion. They're the enemy. They speak badly about my worldview and people that I hold dear. So we see them in a very kind of solid way. We see them as inherently problematic, inherently stupid. They're the cause of all my troubles, and they're the cause why the world is going down. Okay, so that's the second group. We overlay more aversive views, or causes us to see them as worse than they are. And then we have the neutral crowd, which is people that don't know us, we don't know them. For the most part, we don't even think about them. Some of us don't really care what happens to people we don't know. Some of us do, but so that's basically like three groups, and they're all based on ego. The entire world is categorized into these three groups. And we think in our mind, we're like, oh, this is wholesome group, this is an unwholesome group. But it's like, in reality, that's just your reality, and your reality is valid for you. But that's not the actual reality. the idea is the more we are fundamentally like attached to the ego and over-identified with our mind and our body and our ego and our personality and sense of self, the more we're going to have skewed perception of reality. Because the whole business of ignorance that Buddhism talks about is that the way things appear to you don't truly exist in that kind of way. The reality that you believe is objective is not. It's 100% completely subjective. Now, you could say that certain truths are relative based on the convention. So like I can say that, like, you know, my hair is dark. That according to relative reality, that's an accurate statement. That's a valid statement that we can all share. But even if we discuss color, color is kind of a relative thing. There are people who are colorblind. Their perception of reality and, you know, when it comes to color is going to be like different than for the rest of us. The central premise here is that in order for us to perceive reality, there has to be mind who's perceiving reality. Like, you don't have reality out there existing without the mind that perceives it. It's kind of like going alongside that concept. It's like if the tree in the forest fell and nobody saw it, nobody perceived it. Is there a tree? Did it really fall? So, you know, that's like a little bit, well, that's part of the same concept, right? Like, is there reality past what we can perceive with our senses? So just back to the ego. So the way reality appears to us is totally dependent on the ego. We're completely trapped in ego's little preferences and programming, and we're actually, from that perspective, we're not free. And because the ego mechanism is so automatic and it takes so much effort to disarm the mechanism and to make it go from like super compulsive to something that we can control from inside, you know, until we get to that place, we're not free. That means that, like, you know, if somebody sees me on the street and says something mean, they can totally mess up my day. I mean, do you really want to live in the world where your well-being and your happiness depends on what somebody says or does? So the thing with spirituality and spiritual disciplines, even psychology, is these are all methods that if we follow them through, if we follow through with them, if we practice, we can get to the point of minimizing our ego grasping, which is the source of all our problems. And we can ultimately get to the point where we transcend the ego and we're completely free. Now, transcendence is a very radical concept. You know, we think of spirituality and there are a lot of people who think of spirituality in ways that are just kind of, I'm sorry to say, not valid. They're valid to them, but they're not in a kind of conventional sense. They're not, you know, spirituality has always been about transcendence. If you check back, you know, you look at Buddhism, that's been around for 2,600 years. And then you have other spiritual traditions, you know, of the yogis, you know, pre-Buddhist. You have Bon, you have Hinduism, you have Christian mystics, you have Islamic mystics. All of these, you know, when you tap into the mystical traditions, doesn't matter what tradition you're from, doesn't matter what the dogma is, what the story is, the attainment revolves around the same thing. And the idea is that people who are realized are completely at peace. They tend to project the attitude of love, compassion, kindness, right? So, and this is something that's very possible and very doable. And this is the purpose of spirituality, in fact. Now, there are different extents to which we can pursue spirituality. So, you know, and there are different goals. Like, some people are interested in things that look spiritual because, you know, they derive some level of peace. It helps their day-to-day life. Perhaps they're not even aware that it's possible to transcend the ego and so forth. But in reality, that's our potential. You know, the potential of an oak is an oak tree. In the same way, potential of human beings is total transcendence, which in Buddhism is called Buddhahood. And in some other traditions, you know, there are different definitions. Nirvana, or like in a Thelemic tradition, it's basically crossing Dhat and reaching Kether and going beyond. So all these things, all these different traditions have a concept of transcendence. And this is basically the purpose of spirituality. Now, there are a lot of different steps and levels in between that we can reach. Now, if we understand what is possible for us, and this is the understanding we can derive by studying any of the mystical traditions and, you know, reading about the masters and kind of trying to wrap our head about what it takes psychologically to be that kind of a person. Like, for example, what does it take for me to become a master? If we can identify a master as somebody who is completely self-sufficient in deriving their own happiness. Their happiness does not come from the outside, it comes primarily from inside. They're not triggered by what other people say or do, or even things that people might do to them, imposing some kind of violence. And, if you have doubts about that, you can read accounts of Tibetan Buddhist lamas who were in Chinese prisons and lived through horrendous torture and still were able to not lose their connection with compassion and did not have actual hatred for their torturers. Anyway, that's like pretty out there, but it is possible, right? And it is possible to find evidence of these attainments in different people. But if we do some like reverse engineering, and I ask myself, okay, so I know that I have capacity for love. I know that I can be joyful inside of myself. I know that I can be happy even if I don't have, this person or that object near me, right? So that's something that's possible. Now, what are the things that are in the way of me being able to actually get to that point? So then you do reverse engineering and you're like, well, first I have to reduce my ego grasping. I have to be more in charge of my, control my anger. I have to take responsibility for myself and for my emotions. And I have to believe that it's possible for me to go away with these like negative states of mind, which cause me suffering, and grow my positive potential, right? It is entirely in our hands. Nobody's coming to save you. There is nobody out there who's going to come and extract your problems out of your mind for you. You have to do it yourself. We have to do it by ourselves. And how we do it? We do it through practice. Meditation, for instance, in Tibetan Buddhism, there is a lot of analytical meditations where you basically sit down and you analyze your mind. If you have a problem, you sit down with your problem and you analyze, like, where is this problem actually coming from? Is it coming from that person or is it coming from me? Luckily on this channel, I share a lot of these methods, like for example, equanimity. Equanimity practice teaches us to learn how to relate to people outside of the ego, outside of the place of the ego. So like instead of seeing dividing world into friends, enemies, and strangers, we train our mind to relate to people on an equal keel. Not based on what they do for me, which further informs and strengthens my ego grasping, but relating to people on the basis of the notion that like everybody wants to be happy and nobody wants to suffer, and everybody makes mistakes. I don't have to take things personally. And, when people make mistakes, I don't have to be emotionally invested in that, It's a long journey out and it's very intense, but it all really comes down to our willingness, first of all, understanding what's possible, our willingness to do the work and fortitude in, just staying focused on what really matters instead of wasting our time, like watching, binge watching Netflix all day or like scrolling on social media, which further reinforces ego grasping. Bottom line is that we all have the same potential and we can all do better and we can all grow, and we can grow to be perfectly fulfilled and happy and transcend all the problems. And this is a moment where I can drop a little advertisement that my course is almost ready to launch. And in this course, I offer a kind of a systematic path, utilizing, incorporating everything that I studied, learned, practiced, and grew from in the course of the last 20 years. For those of you who don't want to buy a course, you don't have to. I share a lot on my social media, on Instagram, on YouTube, and I try as much as possible to share things that I know worked for me, that I know have reduced my ego grasping, so I know it works, and things that, I know have helped others. That's it for now. I wish everybody fruitful journey. May we all transcend our egos. May we all contribute to making this world a better place. And let's do it. Let's reach our potential.